Simona Del Rey's resignation from the Italian Sea Group, or ISG, well, she's the chairwoman of the shipbuilder that produced the Bayesian. That didn't happen in a vacuum. It came amidst a lawsuit accusing the New York Times of slander.
I got nightmares in my head, I fear thoughts build up until I can't. My mind fills up into a creature, and it haunts me somewhere much deeper. I got nightmares in my head, I fear.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. I have to say, when I read the article, even before the lawsuit was announced, I didn't agree that the reason the Bayesian sank was all engineering and nothing else, although the tall mast and heavy keel, which was retracted at the time, were certainly important factors. And the New York Times also seems to be getting lazy when it comes to researching the facts, a criticism I don't make lightly. I say this because it was the finding of the investigators and prosecutors that the ship sank stern first, which is to say it filled with water from the rear before submerging. It didn't capsize. It only tipped over once it hit the seabed. And yet the New York Times inaccurately reports the sinking in the way that many of us would anticipate in a sailboat with such an oversized mast, tipping over. The fact that almost all the deceased, including the ship owner Mike Lynch, were all huddled together below deck but closer to the bow side, in other words the front of the ship, also seems to reinforce the notion that they were trying to escape the boat flooding from the stern, and in order to do that they headed towards the bow. They left their quarters in order to do that. The only exception was Lynch's daughter Hannah. Now, after sailing on 2 different yachts in Greece recently, I feel my opinion on this case has needed a little recalibration. Before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. If you find this analysis worthwhile, and bear in mind the footage you're seeing was actually recorded on 2 different yachts. If you find that interesting, worthwhile, please hit the thanks button and let's get started. Let me begin by conceding that the design was a factor, and the New York Times rightly points out the single large mast was not just a different design, but it was radically different. Some might even say an exotic design. The New York Times refers to it as a compromise design with a question mark. The mast wasn't just tall, it was more than 40 feet taller than its predecessors, but crucially, it was very heavy, around 24 tons of aluminum. So you could excuse any captain from saying under their breath.
Shit, she's got a fat ass.
Quoting from the New York Times, in this area of design, they write, construction on its hull began in 2005 at a shipyard in Tuzla, Turkey. That's according to the boat's documents. But the original buyer for this yacht didn't want the standard 2-mast design. It's obviously some idiosyncrasy from the wealthy purchaser. He wanted special treatment. Instead, the Italian Sea Group said he wanted the boat to be built with 1 large mast for better sailing performance. I'm not sure if that was the only reason. He probably wanted it to look good. He probably wanted to be able to say, I've got a yacht with the tallest, or almost the tallest mast in the world, and he probably also wanted it to be a singularly standout yacht, just like I guess he imagined himself to be. But in any event, whatever the reason was, that led to a radically different design, and that is according to 3 people with knowledge of what followed. And that led to, in the New York Times' words, a cascade of modifications. And a lot of the time when you do this, you have unforeseen consequences. And some of these modifications were to accommodate the gigantic mast, and then others were for stylistic or other reasons. Now, from a distance, the Bayesian might look better than other yachts, but in a real sense it was worse. The ballast, which is used to offset the mast, to lower its center of gravity, was done, for example, in a peculiar way. Now, going back to the New York Times, Small notes on hull diagrams in the Bayesian's document show that the Turkish shipyard revised the ballast in July 2006, nearly 10 months after the keel was laid, which is one of the first steps of production. So you kind of get the feeling that they realized that there was a problem, and so they were sort of making it up as they went along. Values updated as from information by Yildiz, the notes say in all caps, naming the shipyard. But where this ballast was placed was curious, maritime experts said. Rather than spreading the ballast evenly across the bottom of the boat, which would have guaranteed the best stability, the builders stacked it, get this, toward the rear of the ship's hull. Now, is it any coincidence then that the ship sank from the rear side? Now, Mr. Roberts, the naval architect, said, "When I first saw this, I couldn't believe it. It made no sense to me." Going back to the article, the ballast seems to have been pushed toward the rear of the boat to offset the single heavy mast closer toward the front, Mr. Roberts concluded. He said he had never seen the main ballast used in such a design tactic before. So the other thing is that lighter carbon fiber masts have replaced aluminum, but this also raises an interesting issue, one we dealt with when we were looking at the Titan submersible. Was the Bayesian certified safe to sail? Well, apparently it was. Again, referring to the article, making sure superyacht is fit for the seas is a job left to a network of private companies and public agencies, and the Bayesian's design was approved by the American Bureau of Shipping. That's the ABS. I think we dealt with them with the Titan submersible, as well as the British Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. The question is, should it have been approved? Going back to the article, the documents also show that the Bayesian could begin taking on some water at angles that appeared to violate the safety threshold set by the British Maritime and Coast Guard Agency. Apparently not by the ABS agency, just by the one. The Italian Sea Group responded that the boat was in line with regulations and had been approved. When asked how that happened, an agency spokesman refused to clarify, citing the continuing investigations. That's definitely quite interesting. So there does seem to be something dodgy, possibly, in how the boat got certified, just as we saw with the Titan submersible. Where I disagree with the New York Times is that they place all the emphasis on the design being the culprit and nothing else. Are you telling me of the course of its almost 20-year existence, the Bayesian, a sailboat, for God's sake, had never seen wind gusts of 60 knots or nearly 70 miles an hour before? Are you saying the first time it experiences gusts like that, it's going to sink? So we must look at the thing in context. The Bayesian was the only boat in a situation surrounded by boats, and so it was the only one to suffer damage and sink. Why? I would venture that we are dealing with three factors, the least of which is the storm, but clearly without the storm as a precipitating factor, none of this would have happened. And so have a look at this footage, the CCTV footage of the storm, which gives you an idea of the intensity of the storm itself. And we can see for a brief period the storm was quite intense. So I would say the storm does carry blame, arguably 20%. That brings us to mistakes by the crew. According to the New York Times, the biggest question that investigators are focused on is how the Bayesian filled with water so fast. Was it because of the weather, because of the design, or because of the crew? To many in the yachting world, it doesn't make sense. Well, what about the crew? My impression is that the New York Times is the most slippery in this area. They write, for example, witnesses, an Italian official familiar with the investigation, and the underwater video challenged the company's version of events. The footage appeared to show the watertight door to the engine room closed, and the Italian official said the divers had not seen any open hatches on the hull. Mr. Borner, that's the captain of the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, the ship that is right beside the Bayesian, also said that after rescuing the captain, he asked him if he had shut the hatches. The captain said he had. Mr. Borner shared pictures taken by his guests a few moments before the Bayesian sank that appeared to show that the hull hatches were closed. Now, but there's far more to the crew's responsibilities than simply closing the doors. Firstly, there's the question whether the crew anticipated the storm, just like the fishermen in that nearby port did as well. That's why no one went out that morning, because they knew a storm was on its way. And so that seems to be an obvious no, that they didn't anticipate the storm, and that's why they didn't orient the vessel accordingly. And that is, I think, an obvious difference between the Bayesian and the Sir Robert Baden-Powell. If this supposition is correct, and it may not be, but if it is, then we must ask why the crew of one yacht were activated and took precautions while another seemingly did not. I think one answer could be that the crew of the Bayesian felt their boat was bigger, better, and unsinkable, and thus they didn't really need to do anything. They had the luxury of doing nothing. In other words, perhaps there was a sense of entitlement. Among the crew. They had some very, very important guests on board, and that probably made the crew feel they were also more important. The timing is also important. The incident happened very early on a Monday morning during a celebratory voyage. It's very likely everyone, passengers and crew, celebrated more than they ought to have done. Also probably got a very late night. And this may, at the very least, have compromised many of the passengers, in particular, who'd partied up a storm, not only on Sunday night going into Monday morning, but also Friday night and Saturday night. I was on yachts in Greece. What do you do on board except celebrate, drink, and be merry? To be fair, possibly the impact of the storm on the one vessel was different, but I don't think the time for reorienting the Bayesian was during the storm, but prior to the storm. And that, I think, is the main difference between the two vessels. In CCTV footage captured at the time, we can see how the storm intensifies and weakens. From about 4:03 a.m. to just prior to 4:07 a.m., just have a look at this. The storm is intense, especially during the 4th minute. The CCTV also confirms that the storm manifests relatively quickly, but weather data and lightning and simple visual scanning ought to have provided plenty of advance warning. Now, when I was in Greece, I sailed on 2 different boats with 2 different crews. On the one boat, we drank wine and the crew were kind and considerate. On the other, the crew hardly spoke to us and were actually quite rude. I do think there's a real possibility of crew error here. If a woman was able to save a baby, why couldn't the crew raise the alarm, alert and chaperone all the other passengers to safety? I'm not going to take it further than that, except to say the question is, if 20% of the tragedy is due to the weather, how much is design and crew part of the remaining 80%? And I would say design is a bigger factor than the weather, at least 30%, if not more. And so where does that leave us in terms of the crew? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.